13 minutes after takeoff, at 17,300 feet, the left windscreen of a British Airways jet left the aircraft. The captain went with it. He was pulled out of his seat and through the hole, and he stopped only because his legs caught on the control column. For the next 20 minutes, a member of the cabin crew held him there, outside the aeroplane, in a 300-mile-an-hour airstream. Every one of the 87 people on board survived. The captain was back in a cockpit 5 months later. This is the story of how that happened, and of the 84 bolts that made it happen, chosen the night before by one man by eye. Sunday, the 10th of June, 1990. International Airport, early on a clear summer morning. British Airways Flight 53902. 81 passengers, 4 cabin crew, 2 pilots. A holiday flight, full of people going to the Costa del Sol. The aircraft was a BAC One-Eleven, a British-built twin jet, 22 years old, rear engines, small and quick. Nothing about it was unusual. The One-Eleven was Britain's answer to the short-haul jet. 2 engines mounted at the tail, a high tail, room for about 90 passengers. It flew the routes that did not justify anything bigger. By 1990, it was an old design being worked hard. 5 or 6 sectors a day, short hops around Europe, turnarounds measured in minutes. The passengers that morning were what you would expect on a Sunday flight to the Spanish coast in June. Families, couples, a school party. Nobody on board had any reason to think about the front windscreen. In the left seat, Captain Tim Lancaster, 42 years old, 11,000 flying hours. In the right seat, First Officer, 39. Flew the takeoff. Once they were climbing away, he handed control to Lancaster, as crews do, and the two of them settled into the routine of a short flight. They released their shoulder harnesses. Both men kept their lap belts loosely fastened. That detail matters later. This is normal practice. Shoulder harnesses are worn for takeoff and landing. In the cruise, crews loosen them to reach switches and paperwork. The rule quietly assumes the flight deck stays intact. Behind them, the cabin crew had started the breakfast service. Steward Ogden came forward to the flight deck with tea. The other 3 were Rogers, John, and Susan Prince. Between them, they had a cabin of 81 people and about 20 minutes of routine work ahead. 13 minutes after takeoff, they were passing 17,300 feet, still climbing over in. There was a bang. Not an explosion, a single, enormous report, as if a door had been slammed by something much stronger than a person. The left windscreen was gone. In its place was a hole a meter across, and the pressurized air inside the cabin went out through it in less than a second. That is what explosive decompression means in practice. The air inside is at roughly the pressure of a hill. The air outside at that height is thin and freezing. The difference does not leak, it leaves. The cabin had been pressurized to the equivalent of about 6,000 feet. Outside was 17,300. That gap is roughly 4 pounds on every square inch of the aircraft's skin. Across a windscreen the size of a large television, 4 pounds per square inch adds up to more than a ton of steady force, trying to push the pane outwards for every second of every flight. When the pane goes, all of that resolves at once. The air does not drift out. It accelerates through the hole at close to the speed of sound, and it takes with it anything that is not bolted down. Everything loose in the flight deck went with it. Checklists, charts, flight documents, the crew's paperwork, all of it out through the hole in a fraction of a second. And Captain Lancaster, his lap belt was loose. He was lifted straight out of his seat, head first, and driven through the opening until his knees hooked over the control column. Outside, the aircraft was moving at about 345 miles an hour through air, 17 degrees below zero. At that speed, an airstream is not wind. It is closer to being held underwater in a fast river. It flattens clothing, forces the eyes shut, and turns breathing into something you have to fight for. At that altitude, useful consciousness without oxygen lasts a few minutes at best. This is why the first thing any crew does after a decompression is go down, and go down quickly. The door to the passenger cabin was blown off its hinges and landed on the throttle levers, pushing the engines forward while the aircraft was already climbing away. In the cabin behind, the oxygen masks dropped. Passengers heard the bang and felt the air change, but most of them could not see what had happened at the front. This is worth sitting with for a moment. For most of the people on board, the accident was a bang, a rush of cold, and a cabin crew suddenly moving with a purpose nobody explained. They could not see the flight deck. They did not know the captain was outside the aircraft. They knew only that something had happened and that the aeroplane was going down. Ogden, the steward who had come forward with the tea, was standing in the flight deck doorway when it happened. He was the only person close enough to reach the captain. He grabbed Lancaster around the waist and legs and locked himself in the doorway. Everything he was holding was being pulled towards the hole, including the man in his arms. Ogden's own account is precise about the physics. He was not lifting a man. He was resisting a suction that wanted them both, in a doorway with nothing to brace against except the frame. Behind him, the other 3 cabin crew were doing the job they had trained for and never expected to use. Getting 81 people onto oxygen and braced, in a cabin full of noise and freezing air. That grip did not loosen for the next 20 minutes. When Ogden's arms gave out, other crew members took his place, and they passed the captain's legs between them like a rope. John and Rogers took the weight in turns. Susan Prince worked the cabin, kept the passengers braced, and answered questions nobody had answers to. Not one of them had trained for this, because nobody writes a procedure for holding a colleague outside an aircraft. They improvised it, and they held the improvisation for 20 minutes. While that was happening on the left, the man on the right had a different problem. Had to fly an aeroplane he could not hear, could not talk through, and could barely look at. The noise of a hole that size at that speed is not a wind sound. It is a physical force. Communication inside the flight deck was impossible. Declared an emergency, but he could not hear the replies from air traffic control. For several minutes, London had a mayday call and no answer to their questions. He also set the transponder to 7700. 4 digits that turn an aircraft on a radar screen into a declared emergency without a word being spoken. That is what saved the coordination. Controllers could see the emergency, the descent and the turn, and they cleared the sky around him while he was unable to explain anything at all. On their screens, the controllers watched the aircraft descend and turn without knowing why, and without knowing whether anyone was still flying it. Brought the aircraft down. He needed thicker air for the people on board, and he needed the airspeed low enough that the men holding the captain could keep holding him. A normal emergency descent is flown fast and steep. Speed breaks out, nose down, get to 10,000 feet before anybody runs out of oxygen. Here the normal procedure would have killed the captain, so he flew a compromise that no checklist covers. Down quickly enough for the cabin, slowly enough for the man outside. In an aircraft he was hand-flying with a cabin door lying on the throttles. Every knot he took off made it easier to hold the captain, and harder to keep a heavy jet flying steadily. He chose a speed and held it. He also had a captain's body across the front of his instrument panel, and a cabin door lying across his throttles. He worked around both. In the doorway, the crew had a decision of their own. From where they stood it looked as though Lancaster was already dead. His face was slamming against the outside of the windscreen frame. His eyes were open and unblinking. His arms were flailing in the airstream. They discussed letting him go. The fear was not cruelty. It was that his body would strike the tail or be sucked into an engine and turn a survivable emergency into a crash. That fear was not irrational. The engines on a 111 are mounted at the tail, directly downstream of the flight deck. It was the correct thing to be afraid of. They decided to keep holding. Rogers took over from Ogden, whose shoulder had dislocated and whose face was freezing to the frame of the aircraft. Had to choose an airport. The obvious answer was the nearest one. The right answer was more complicated and had long runways and full emergency services. But they were further away and busier, and every extra minute was a minute somebody had to keep holding a man in a gale. Controllers offered him the options. He weighed runway length against time, and time against a man being held by his legs at the front of the aircraft. Southampton was closer. Its runway was short for a jet, about 1.75 miles, and the aircraft was still heavy with the fuel loaded for Spain. He chose Southampton, and he chose not to spend time dumping fuel. He would land heavy on a short runway and stop it. Landing heavy is not only about stopping distance. Brakes turn motion into heat, and a heavy jet on a short runway can boil its brakes and start a fire after it is safely stopped. Southampton's fire crews were positioned for exactly that. The aircraft came in fast, touched down, and used most of what the runway had to give. At 5 to 9, 22 minutes after the bang, the 111 touched down at Southampton and stopped on the runway. 22 minutes. From a bang at 17,000 feet to wheels stopped on a runway. Read the transcript, and what stands out is how ordinary the voices sound. That is not coldness. That is training doing exactly what training is for, making an impossible situation into a series of small, ordinary decisions that a person can actually execute. Emergency crews had been waiting. The first thing they saw as the aircraft rolled to a stop was a man hanging out of the left side of the flight deck, still held by the legs. Tim Lancaster was alive. Frostbite, bruising, shock, fractures in his right arm, his left thumb, and his right wrist. Nothing that would not heal. He had spent 20 minutes at freezing temperature in a supersonic-feeling airstream, and he was awake and talking within hours. Doctors credited the cold itself with slowing everything down. Nobody died. On an aircraft that lost a windscreen at 17,000 feet and landed with its captain outside it, the death toll was 0. Ogden came out of it worse than his injuries suggested: a dislocated shoulder, frostbite to his face, and years of what the report politely calls the aftereffects. An aircraft windscreen does not simply fall out. To understand why this one did, you have to look at how it was attached, and here the 111 is unusual. On most airliners, a window is a plug. The pane is larger than the hole, and cabin pressure pushes it into its frame. The harder you pressurize, it seals. The 111 windscreen was fitted from the outside. Pressure pushed it away from the aircraft, not into it. The only thing resisting that push was a ring of bolts, 84 of them. On that design, the bolts are not a detail. The bolts are the structure. Designers knew this. The specification for those bolts is exact, down to thousandths of an inch, precisely because there is no second line of defense behind them, which means the whole safety of that joint rests on one assumption: that whoever fits it uses the part number written in the manual, and not the part that looks right. 27 hours before the flight, that windscreen had been replaced. The work was done overnight by the shift maintenance manager, working alone. He removed the old windscreen and its old bolts. Then he needed 84 new ones, and this is where the accident actually happened. He was not careless in the way that word usually implies. He was an experienced manager, doing a job he had done before on a night shift without help. The stores were not well lit. The bins held fasteners that differ by amounts a person cannot see. And the job was one that the rules allowed a single person to complete and certify alone. He took one of the old bolts as a sample, went to the carousel of parts bins, and matched it against what was there by eye. Aircraft fasteners look alike. They are graded by diameter and length in fractions that a person cannot judge by holding two of them together under a work lamp. The bolts he chose were the wrong ones, not obviously wrong by a few hundredths of an inch. 78 of the 84 were about 26 thousandths of an inch too small in diameter. The other 6 were the right diameter, but a tenth of an inch too short. 26 thousandths of an inch is about the thickness of a fingernail. Held in a hand, in a hanger at night, that difference does not exist. A bolt does not hold by being present. It holds by clamping, and clamping depends on the threads engaging fully and the head bearing evenly on the surface around it. An undersized bolt sits loose in its hole. Instead of clamping the pane against the frame, it lets the pane move, and every pressurization cycle works the joint a little further open. The aircraft flew one uneventful sector after the work was signed off. On the second, at 17,000 feet, the joint finally let go. Held against 9 tons of pressure trying to push a windscreen off an aeroplane. It is the whole story. Investigators recovered the windscreen from a field inn. The bolts were still in it, and measuring them took an afternoon. Understanding how they got there took the rest of the inquiry. The obvious question is why nobody checked. The answer is the part of this accident that changed procedures rather than parts. The manager was working a night shift, alone, on a job the manual allowed one person to certify. He signed off his own work. That was permitted. The correct part numbers were in the maintenance documentation. He did not use them, because matching an old bolt against a bin is faster, and it had always worked before. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch named the individual error, and then spent most of the report on the system that let a single unverified judgment reach a pressurized aircraft. They found the same shortcut had been used on the same aircraft before. They found the lighting and the storage in the parts area made visual matching easy and checking hard. Their recommendations were unglamorous and specific. Check the fasteners on safety-critical assemblies independently. Improve the stores so that similar parts cannot be confused. Stop treating one signature as verification. Aviation has learned this lesson more than once. A repair done wrong on a Japanese jet in 1978 brought it down 7 years later. A fuselage opened up over Hawaii in 1988 for related reasons. Every one of those started in a hangar, with a person doing a job they had done many times before, under time pressure, without a second pair of eyes on the result. After it, British Airways changed how safety-critical work is certified, and the industry moved further away from one person signing off their own job. That is the quiet legacy of Flight 5390, not a new part, a rule about who is allowed to say that a job is finished. Tim Lancaster recovered. He went back to flying for British Airways 5 months after the accident, and later flew for another airline until he retired. Who actually landed the aircraft was given the Queen's Commendation for valuable service in the air. So were 3 of the cabin crew. Has said more than once that he was doing his job, and that the people who deserve the attention are the ones who spent 20 minutes refusing to let go. Ogden never fully escaped it. He carried the shoulder injury and the frostbite, and he left the airline some years later. The aircraft itself was repaired and flew on for another 11 years. The windscreen design itself did not change. What changed was the paperwork around it, and in aviation, paperwork is not bureaucracy. It is the mechanism by which a mistake gets caught before it flies. If you fly this week, somebody will sign for a job on your aircraft, and somebody else will independently check it. That second signature exists because of days like the 10th of June, 1990. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is the reason this story is told so often in flight safety courses rather than in true crime documentaries. Nothing about the outcome was luck. The first officer flew a stable descent under conditions that would justify panic. The cabin crew made a decision under pressure and then simply did not change their minds. And the aircraft, mishandled 27 hours earlier by a single unverified judgment, held together for everything else that was asked of it. There is a temptation to file this as a freak event. It is the opposite. Every part of it was ordinary. An ordinary night shift. An ordinary shortcut that had worked 100 times. An ordinary difference of a few hundredths of an inch, 26 thousandths of an inch, by an aircraft's worth of pressure against a crew who decided not to let go. 87 people boarded that aeroplane. 87 people walked away from it. In this business, that is as close to a good ending as the files get. If you want the next file opened, subscribe. There are a lot of them, and most of them turn on something this small.